So, the Onimusha demo dropped on June 2nd, and after spending about an hour with it, I think I have a much better idea of what Capcom is trying to do here. What's interesting is that this doesn't really feel like the Onimusha I grew up with. I've played every game in the series. I was there back when the original game was basically Resident Evil in feudal Japan. Then we watched the series slowly become more action-focused with each release. Even with all those changes though, there was still a certain feeling that tied the games together. This new one feels like it's taking another step forward. Not necessarily in a bad way either. There were moments during the demo where I was having a great time, especially once the combat system started opening up. But there were also a few moments where I found myself wondering whether Capcom is trying to add a little too much all at once. The funny thing is that I didn't even reach that conclusion from the combat. The first thing I did was exactly what most PC players do when they boot up a demo. I immediately went into the settings menu. And I have to give Capcom credit here. A lot of demos feel like they're thrown together at the last minute. You get the bare minimum settings, a couple of graphic sliders, and that's about it. This one actually felt like they put some effort into the PC version. You can see exactly how much memory different settings are using, you get detailed graphics options to mess around with, and everything feels pretty straightforward to navigate. It's the sort of thing you don't really appreciate until you've played enough bad PC ports. After that, I had to choose a difficulty. The demo gives you story and action. Story mode is apparently for people who want to sit back and enjoy the ride, basically noobs, while action is the one I picked since I assumed it was meant to be the standard experience. Hoping there are harder options in the full game though. You can also choose between two controller layouts. One leans more aggressively into offense while the other is built around a more defensive setup. It's a small thing, but it shows Capcom is already thinking about different playstyles before you even take your first swing. A few minutes later, I was finally in the game, and the first thing that hit me wasn't the combat, it was the location.
The malice is thickest over there. Now, how do I get there?
The demo takes place at Kiyomizu-dera Temple in Kyoto. The moment I realized where I was, I kinda stopped moving for a second. I've actually been there before. When I visited Japan a few years ago, it was one of the highlights of the entire trip. It's one of those places that looks impressive in photographs, but feels completely different when you're standing there in person. So walking through this version of it was pretty surreal. Only this time, it's filled with corpses, demons, and whatever horrible things Ganryu have decided to do to the place. It's a weird thing to say, but knowing the real location actually made the corruption feel more effective to me. So you recognize parts of it, you know what it's supposed to look like, and then the game twists it into something completely different. Visually, the RE engine continues to do what it always does. I played it safe, and I took it to 1080p and locked it to 60 frames per second just to avoid introducing any performance problems on my end. But even with those settings, the game looked fantastic. The environment detail is excellent, lighting looks great, and character models are ridiculously detailed up close. Musashi in particular looks fantastic. You can see it in the face, the hair, the clothing, even the smaller movements while he's standing still. There was one thing that felt a little off though. Some of his animations almost felt too animated, if that makes sense. Every movement has a lot of weight behind it, which looks great visually, but every now and then I felt a slight disconnect between pressing a button and seeing the action fully happen on screen. Nothing major, but just enough that I noticed it. And once I started moving through the temple, the game began introducing what is probably the most important mechanic in the entire demo. The further I got, the more obvious it became that almost everything in this combat system revolves around one thing: parrying. I mean, dodging is important too, but once you start moving through the temple, the game begins introducing these basics. Movement, sprinting, stamina management, absorbing souls, all the usual stuff you'd expect from the opening section of an action game. But it didn't take long before one thing became very obvious. This game really wants you to parry. Not in the sense that it's a useful option sitting somewhere in your toolkit, it feels much more essential than that. The entire combat system seems to be built around the idea of reading attacks, timing your responses correctly, and turning defense into offense. Naturally, the first comparison people are going to make is with Sekiro. After playing the demo though, I don't think most players are going to struggle nearly as much as they did with Sekiro's timing. The window feels fairly generous, at least against the enemies Capcom chose to include here. Within a few minutes, I was landing parries consistently, and before long it started feeling pretty natural. At the same time, the game doesn't stop there. You're also learning how different souls types work. Red souls are tied to progression, yellow souls restore health, blue souls fuel Oni abilities, and I'm willing to bet there are more systems waiting later in the full game. And that's where I started noticing something else that was pretty interesting. The original Onimusha games were fairly straightforward. There was depth there, but it was usually hidden underneath relatively simple mechanics. This new version feels much more layered right from the beginning. The demo keeps handing you new tools almost immediately, and the further I got, the more it felt like Capcom wanted combat encounters to revolve around juggling multiple systems at once. Then the game slows things down for a moment and introduces the people you're supposedly trying to save. Eventually, you come across a group of refugees hiding inside the temple. There's not a huge amount of story here yet, but it does give you a glimpse of how the game seems to be handling its supporting cast. These background NPCs seem to exist purely to point you toward the next objective. However, my impression was that the people you meet throughout the journey are probably going to have a larger role in the overall story. After speaking with them, you're directed toward the source of the corruption spreading throughout the area. This is also when you get your first real look at the map, and if there's one word I'd use to describe the level design of the demo, it's pretty much controlled. The path winds around the temple grounds and branches occasionally, but you're never really allowed to wander very far. There are invisible walls in plenty of places, and the game is clearly guiding you toward the next encounter almost constantly. Normally that might sound like criticism, but I'm not entirely convinced it's a problem. Older Onimusha games weren't exactly open-world adventures either. They were usually focused experiences with carefully designed routes, puzzles, combat encounters, and progression systems. The demo feels like it's following that same philosophy, just on a larger scale. I did laugh when I discovered you can't attack civilians though. I know it makes sense, but I still tried. Before long, the game stops focusing on exploration and starts expanding the combat systems again. The next major mechanic the demo introduces is the blazing state. Successful parries deal heavy stamina damage to enemies, and as you keep fighting, killing enemies, and landing defensive counters, your blazing state meter starts filling up. Once activated, you gain access to flashy executions that feel ripped straight out of classic samurai cinema. You know exactly the kind of scene I'm talking about. One clean slash, a brief pause, then the enemy falls apart a second later. It's simple, but it never gets old. The game also starts introducing enemy archers around this point, and surprisingly, you can parry their arrows too. What I liked here is that Musashi doesn't force you to be perfectly lined up with every incoming attack. If an enemy strikes from a slightly different angle, he'll often adjust naturally and block in that direction. It makes the combat feel responsive without demanding absolute precision from the player, and this is probably where the combat started clicking for me. The more systems the game introduced, the more I realized they all seem to orbit around the same core idea. Parries lead to stamina breaks lead to executions lead to more resources lead to stronger abilities, etc, etc. Everything feeds back into itself. There was one thing I wasn't completely sold on though. Musashi talks. A lot. At first, it didn't really bother me, but I definitely started noticing how frequently he comments on kills, encounters, and random situations. It's not enough to ruin anything, but it was sitting in the back of my mind as I kept playing. And then the game introduced another character that made me even more curious about where Capcom is taking this version of Onimusha. A little later, you begin communicating with the Oni Gauntlet itself. And yes, apparently the Gauntlet is a woman now.
Of the malice in this area, along with memories of the cruelty that created it. To purify this temple, you will need to find the source of this vision.
Right, Gauntlet Lady. Enough of that. If you're awake, I've got questions.
I refuse.
You listen here.
I won't answer, questions or otherwise, to Gauntlet Lady. I was briefly awake thanks to the energy of that dark mass. But now I am not.
Hey!
This section introduces Oni Vision, which lets you see things hidden from normal sight. In the demo, that mostly means spotting these creepy little demon spider hand creatures that lock doors and environments. But it's pretty easy to imagine this mechanic being expanded into other puzzles, secrets, or exploration later on. The ability itself is fine. What caught my attention more was the dialogue. I mean, the conversations between Musashi and the Gauntlet immediately feel different from what I remember from the older games. There's more back and forth, more commentary, more personality being pushed into the moment-to-moment experience. I'm sure some players might like that, but I'm still kind of figuring out how I feel about it. It's giving me a little bit of the Forspoken vibes, if you know what I mean. Part of me misses the quieter atmosphere the series used to have. On the other hand, this clearly isn't trying to be the exact same version of Onimusha that existed 20 years ago. And that's a thought that kept coming back throughout the entire demo. Almost every new mechanic, every new conversation, every new system felt like Capcom trying to modernize the series in some way. Sometimes it worked really well. And the next mechanic they introduced was probably my favorite example of that. Once you get past the Oni Vision section, the game starts introducing new enemy types. You run into these strange lizard-like Genma that spin and launch themselves at you. And by this point, you're already thinking you've probably seen most of what the combat system has to offer. Then Capcom introduces Blade Barrages. I think this one's my favorite part of the demo. When certain enemies clash with Musashi, both combatants lock weapons and enter a sword struggle. Instead of simply mashing a button, you're asked to alternate between light and heavy attacks in the correct rhythm to overpower your opponent. Mechanically, it's pretty simple and silly. Visually though, it looks fucking fantastic. The camera tightens up, sparks are flying everywhere, blades are grinding against each other, and for a few seconds, it genuinely feels like one of those classic samurai duels where two fighters are testing each other's strength before somebody finally, breaks. What surprised me is that it didn't feel like some throwaway cinematic mechanic. A lot of games add flashy moments that look cool once and then become repetitive. Here I actually found myself looking forward to seeing it happen again. And that's where the demo started hitting its stride for me. The combat was opening up and the enemy variety was increasing. All the while I was spending less time learning systems and more time actually playing with them. Which is probably why I barely noticed that Capcom was still introducing even more mechanics down the line. The deeper you move into the temple grounds, the more enemy types start appearing. Floating heads show up. New consumable items start appearing. Additional combat encounters become more and more complex. And despite all the systems being layered on top of each other, the game never really became overwhelming. Part of that comes down to how easy the demo is. I know that sounds harsh, but it's true. By this point, I had accumulated a decent stockpile of healing items and never really felt pressured to use them. Most encounters felt manageable even when I made mistakes, which meant I could experiment freely without worrying too much about the consequences. That isn't necessarily a bad thing for a demo. I mean, Capcom clearly wants players to see the mechanics, not get stuck on them. The one addition that surprised me a little was assassinations. You can sneak up behind certain enemies and eliminate them instantly, complete with a stylish execution animation. The animations themselves look great, but I spent most of the demo wondering how much practical value the mechanic will actually have in the finished game. Maybe certain enemy types will encourage stealth approaches, maybe later areas will be built around it more heavily. I'm not sure. I mean, right now it mostly felt like another tool sitting inside an already very crowded toolbox. Then I discovered something far more important. You can cut certain doors apart, and I thought that was pretty cool. Which in turn immediately activated a very specific part of my brain. I immediately got super distracted. I tried to cut every single door I could find, and well, for the next few minutes I was walking around trying to cut absolutely everything. Unfortunately, Capcom only lets you destroy specific doors, but for a brief moment I was convinced I was about to turn the entire temple into a lumberyard. Eventually, that experimentation leads you into one of the best sections of the demo. You break through into a courtyard and suddenly the game starts throwing larger groups of enemies at you. This is where Capcom clearly expects players to put everything together. The parrying, dodging, blocking, soul absorption, stamina management, executions, all of it starts happening at once. Which in turn led to probably the most fun I had during the entire demo. Not because it was difficult, it really was not, but because all the mechanics finally had room to interact with each other. For the first time, I stopped thinking about individual systems and started focusing purely on combat flow. One parry leading into a stagger, the stagger creates an opening, the opening creates some resources, and then you use those resources to fuel stronger attacks. Everything begins feeding into itself naturally. So Capcom even introduces blade locking around this point, which creates these flashy execution sequences that look great on screen. I did notice one thing though, when looking at all these groups, the enemies are extremely, polite. A little too polite. There were multiple moments where I looked around and realized several enemies were basically standing in line waiting for their turn to get murdered. It's one of those things that becomes harder to ignore once you see it. Still, I was having enough fun that it never really bothered me. And just when I thought the demo was winding down, Capcom handed me another weapon and changed the combat again. Eventually, you track down the last of those strange spider-like creatures and reach a cave hidden between two waterfalls. This area contains what's probably the most important reward in the demo, the Twin Celestials. A pair of Oni forged blades that work very differently from Musashi's standard weapon. Unlike your normal attacks, these blades are tied directly to your Oni power. You need to fill the gauge using blue souls before you can activate them, and once you do, they become a powerful way to recover health while dealing damage. What I liked is that they don't just feel stronger, they encourage a different rhythm. Suddenly, blue souls become much more valuable. You're paying closer attention to resource management, deciding when to spend your power and when to save it. It's a small addition, but it changes how you approach combat almost immediately. Naturally, Capcom gives you a chance to test them. A mini-boss appears shortly afterward, and the encounter works exactly as you'd hope. You get a parry, break stamina, build resources, etc., eventually getting into using the Twin Celestials. You have to unload everything you got. The fight itself isn't particularly difficult, but it does a good job reinforcing the systems you've been learning throughout the demo. At this point, I thought the demo was about to end. Instead, Capcom decided to save its biggest surprise for the final stretch. After the mini-boss encounter, the demo starts making it pretty clear that something bigger is waiting around the corner. First of all, you get a proper look at one of the larger Genma creatures. This thing looks enormous. Apparently, it survives by eating humans and other Genma as well. The demo doesn't spend much time explaining it, but the creature leaves an impression almost immediately. And then things get worse because, apparently, we still didn't have enough mechanics. At this point, the game introduces grab counters. The concept is simple enough: when an enemy tries to grab you, you dodge at the correct moment and break free. It works fine, but I'll admit that by this point I was starting to wonder how many of these mechanics would remain important throughout the full game. I mean, if we list them all off, we've got parries, stamina breaks, blazing state, blade barrages, blade locks, Oni Vision, assassinations, the twin celestial weapons, which I'm sure means there's going to be a bunch more of those. We got grab counters, and somehow the game still hadn't reached its final encounter. Part of me was impressed, and part of me was wondering if Capcom was trying to fit 3 games worth of ideas into one demo. Fortunately, the final fight ended up answering some of these concerns, because the moment Ganryu appears, the entire experience becomes much more focused. So if you watch the trailers, you probably already know who Ganryu is. He's been featured pretty heavily in the marketing, and unlike most of the enemies you fought up to this point, he feels like someone operating on your level. So he also possesses a gauntlet of his own, though the demo only gives us a small glimpse of what's really happening with him. Most of the regular enemies spend a lot of time throwing attacks at you and waiting to see what happens. Ganryu is different. His swings have purpose, his timing is less predictable, although it was pretty predictable. The windows for parrying felt tighter, and for the first time during the demo, I actually had to pay a little bit of attention. He did kill me on my first attempt though, which to be honest was refreshing, because up until this point, I hadn't really felt threatened by anything.
Oh, this is fun. Oh, you cannot be done already.
The fight also introduces another mechanic built around stamina management. If you completely exhaust Ganryu's stamina gauge, you can target different weak points during the repose sequence. One option deals heavier damage, the other rewards you with additional souls and resources. It's a small decision, but it adds another layer to the combat without feeling unnecessary. More importantly, the fight finally demonstrates why Capcom spent the entire demo teaching you all of these systems. Everything comes into play here. I beat him on my second attempt, and just as the fight seemed ready to escalate into whatever came next, the demo ended. Which was probably the smartest place I could have cut it, because I immediately wanted to keep on playing. So after finishing the demo, where do I land on this new version of Onimusha? Overall, I had a really good time with it. Visually, it's gorgeous. The RE engine continues to be one of the best tools in the industry for this kind of game. Kiyomizu-dera looks fantastic. Musashi looks amazing, and the entire demo has a level of polish that immediately stands out. The combat is also a lot of fun. Once the systems start interacting with each other, there's a satisfying rhythm to everything, with the game constantly rewarding aggressive, stylish play. My biggest concern right now is the difficulty. I know this is a demo, and I know Capcom wants players to experiment, but outside of Ganryu, I never really felt challenged. I mean, my health bar felt enormous, healing resources were practically everywhere, and most encounters ended before they had a chance to become dangerous. I'm hoping the full game offers significantly harder options, because the combat system seems like it would benefit from more pressure. The other thing I'm still not completely sold on is some of the dialogue. The conversations with the Gauntlet didn't really click with me, and Musashi's constant comments during combat started wearing thin long before the demo was over. A lot of the older games had a quieter atmosphere that helped build tension, and right now I think this new version occasionally talks a little too much for its own good. That said, those are concerns. They're not exactly deal breakers, because underneath all of that, I can still see the foundation of a really good action game. And maybe that's the biggest compliment I can give the demo, because by the time it ended, I wasn't thinking about what Onimusha used to be, I was thinking more about whether I could play another hour. And that's usually a pretty good sign. So if you played the demo yourself, let me know what you thought of it. Did the combat click for you as quickly as it did for me, or are you still on the fence about some of the new systems? And as always, if you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It really helps the channel, and I'll be covering more Onimusha news as we get closer to release. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
To trust Musashi's judgment in all matters.
Ori departed. Give me every ounce of power that you have. In return,
Then get going, Onimusha.